You're muted, Ahmed.
Greetings, everybody. Of course, how would we start a Zoom call without not being muted? Hey, everybody. My name is Hamid. Go by he, him with Stop LAPD Spying Coalition, and welcome to our third Tuesday of the evening general meeting conversation, webinar, whatever we want to call it. Today, this third Tuesday, what we wanted to talk about and have a conversation was around the continuing and the historic assault on immigrants, the weaponization of the border, the targeting of the immigrant community. But also, I think another very key subject that we've always kind of touched upon is that as we've always continued to be out on the street and fight this war that is constantly being waged on people in this country by white supremacy and capitalism and patriarchy and racism and white nationalism, that's one battle that we continue fighting. But there's another battle that continues to wage within our movements as well, that how historically our movements have been compromised, how historically there's this constant complicity that continues to happen, particularly within the nonprofits. And the coalition has been kind of touching upon and bringing to light several things, including the academic complicity, the various types of other nonprofit types who are deeply complicit, who become scribes for white supremacy, who provide these frameworks for harm, who create these tools that constantly target us. So that's another piece that we wanted to talk about. And then the third piece was this whole conversation around the good versus bad immigrant that still continues, that who is good and who is bad, who's in, who's out, who makes the cut and who doesn't, and where does all that come from. So as we have a great lineup of folks, but we also wanted to make this a conversational piece. It's not just people talking to you but it's really talking to each other. So we definitely encourage a more interactive conversation. If you have any questions or comments, please post them in chat. We just more recently, maybe about a month ago, started keeping our mics open and our chat open because we've had a history of Zoom bombing. So in a sense, trying to make sure that we maintain the integrity of the space and being respectful towards each other. So hopefully we won't have to deal with that tonight. But please feel free to raise your hand. There's a raise your hand feature function and all of that stuff. And real quickly about the Tuesday evening conversations, that the coalition is based out of Skid Row in downtown Los Angeles. And we would meet for several years, we would meet every Tuesday to have conversations with the community and build that community power through collective learning and planning direct actions, and with the goal towards abolishing this police state and dismantling the systems of harm that we confront on the daily. But we had to really make a sharp pivot in March of 2020 when COVID hit. And since then, we've been having these conversations, wanting to maintain that consistency, wanting to maintain that space to invite the community for these conversations and continue building that power. And today, in about 23 months now, today is webinar number 91. So for the last 91 Tuesdays, you can say, we've been having these conversations. And that doesn't include our teach-ins on surveillance. That doesn't include the other collective conversations that we have had. But it's only been possible because of the support that we have gotten from the community and folks like yourself who want to have a generative conversation. So what we also do is that in these conversations, we always start off by going to our principles. And I'm going to post, and we always pick up one grassroots self-defense principle. Here's the link to that, and I'll also bring it on screen share as well. And this is where you will find it on our website. And today, what we wanted to do was to open this up, and let's see. That's a zine that was created by the amazing Baby Anarchist. And today is this one, an injury to one as an injury to all. So can anybody take a moment to please read it so we can all hear it? Anyone?
Yeah, I'm happy. I'm happy to read it. An injury to one is an injury to all. We shall not tolerate any abuse, oppression, repression, or violations made against any member of our community. We must fight together with marginalized communities to abolish all systems of oppression. You come for one, you come for all.
All right. So let's take a couple minutes to kind of just reflect on that, and if anybody has any thoughts that how does this resonate with you, and what does it mean in our organizing, in our movement building, and just in our daily lives? Any thoughts, any comments?
This manifests, I think, in my everyday life by thinking about how liberation isn't about empathy or sympathy, but or solidarity isn't about empathy or sympathy, but thinking about our liberation as tied to one another, and always centering the most marginalized. Because if we abolish the systems that affect the most marginalized, everybody wins.
Thank you, Kim. Anybody else wants to share their thought? Cool. Okay. Well, maybe we can just move on. Just to share a quick thought, I think that's also like, how do we then create spaces where we build that collective power? How do we create that spaces where people are able to share, just feeling safe in spaces where what is going on in their lives, and how do we build that solidarity where if you come for one, you come for all, and how does that help? And that's the kind of space that the coalition strives to maintain and to build, where it is about collective learning, it is about collective knowledge building, but it's about collective power. But that also not only about like, what actions we're going to take out there, or how do we build our knowledge base as well, but also recognizing that how does being most marginalized play out in people's lives, and what is our responsibility to be looking out for each other and to building that collective power as well. So that's at least like, how my reflection comes into play over here. So here, and also there's also actively there. Okay, there's a couple things that would it also be that these higher institutions of power try to put marginalized groups against each other. There's a comment there as well. Thank you for sharing that, Carla. And Matteo says definitely actively sowing divisions, which is again something of that we will be discussing as well. But just a quick snapshot before we get the conversation going, because we also invited a brother who's back east, who's been on the front lines in the immigrant rights movement, but also movement for human rights and movement towards abolition of these systems as well. So we want to also honor their time as well. I'm really, really happy to see Abraham Paulos, or Abe, who is with the Black Alliance for Just Immigration, and Abe and Meraki work together. So it'll be great to get that conversation rolling. But just to give setting the tone as well, that looking at the history of migration to the United States, and of course, going back 500 years, but just post 1790, I believe it was 1790 was the first time that how in the United States, where they started collecting what they call nativity data. where a free white person was provided or given citizenship. And then through those years, there have been several, acts that have taken place. And it wasn't until the 1850 then full-on structured immigration controls and systems were set in place. And initially, and Abe, you're also in Meraki, you're very well versed in this as well. So please, if I'm missing something, feel free to chime in. How that whole process and structures have evolved. Initially, this was each state had control over their immigration policy, but then it became federalized, and it went through various sort of variations as well. I believe first, between the Department of State, Department of Interior, Department of Labor, Department of Justice, and then now Department of Homeland Security. But I think each one of these is also significant as well when we look at that. Why were these departments? They became that it was sort of incorporated under the enforcement and under the regime of these departments as well. And then we look at that by 1870, the Naturalization Act, which made people of African descent eligible for naturalization as well. But all along, there has been enforcement, which has been a part of this immigration system as well. People talk about the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, but before the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, there was already an act in 1875, which created felonies and completely restricted and made it a crime for contracting Asian labor. And then, in 1903, we see the Anarchist Exclusion Act, which is also very interesting as well, because when you see these big battles, especially the Haymarket strikes in Chicago, which led to the creation of May Day and deportation and sending supposedly anarchists into exile, that was happening as well. And then the Border Patrol was established in 1925. The Bracero program was created in 1942, which then turned into Operation Wetback during Eisenhower's time in 1954. And then obviously the 1965 Immigration and Naturalization Act, the big amnesty in 1986, supposedly the Simpson-Mazzoli Act, and then 1996. The Workplace Enforcement Act, and then the post-2001 NSEERS program, the National Security Entry-Exit Registration Program, then the U.S. Visit Program. So there's a long history of how immigration and the immigration system has evolved. But throughout that, enforcement has been there, but it just sort of like how it shifted is more of a recent development as well. But immigrant rights movement, as far as that is concerned, and I'm just speaking from personal experiences that I got into organizing in Los Angeles in the late 1980s, and it was the immigrant rights movement that really just brought me into grassroots organizing and being out in the streets as well. So kind of had almost like a front row seat in kind of organizing within the immigrant rights movement for at least about a good 20 years. But while the immigrant rights movement, at least in the current time, is reflected back in right around 1990 or the late 1980s, but the fight for rights is nothing new. I mean, this has been going on as long as enslavement and genocide has been going on. And when we continue on into the migration process, fights have been going on as well. So there is a long history, but I think there's a very morbid side of that history as well of immigrant rights movement. And so with that, I'm going to invite my co-facilitator and comrade Meraki to go from there.
Thank you so much, Hamid, and that's a very thorough sort of summary of the history of the immigrant rights movement. So thank you for that context. And so, we're just going to keep this fairly conversational, but, wanted to talk a little bit about how Black migrants have been erased from the immigrant rights movement, right? And we know that the consequences of this has meant, resources not going towards Black migrants in our communities, right? And elected officials not necessarily engaging in Black migrants and not advocating for policies that would benefit Black migrants, right? So, Abraham, I'd love to hear you speak a bit more on this and, what this erasure sort of looked like in your experience and the work you've done.
Thank you so much. I'd love to hear what I think about it also, because it's always changing. But shout out to Shakir, Hamid, Meraki. Thank you so much for having me on here. You guys got a lot of hoodies on for the West Coast. It's 22 degrees right now. I hope you guys are warm, first of all. Safety first. All right, yeah. I mean, so a couple of things. I mean, Hamid, thank you so much for breaking down a lot of those. I would say probably landmark cases, right? Obviously, 1790, which excluded Black people that were enslaved, but then also the indigenous community, right? And so these two populations today are disproportionately in prison. That's not a coincidence, right? And so I think the idea of immigrant rights, as we now know it, right, really was a fight around citizenship, right, to begin with. When we look at least when I look at sort of the fight for citizenship, or sort of the, I wouldn't say the birth, but how immigrant rights movement really came out of, is really, at least from my perspective, is really around the Black freedom movement, right? And when you look at, you brought up the 1870s, which is really important. And I know a lot of folks think that that's a long time ago, but if you think about, let's say, Title 42, right, which is this policy that basically kicks out Haitians, now Venezuelans and Colombians, that was in 1893, right? And they just put that back into effect in 2020. So these things also like do have sort of a modern effect to it. But I say all of that to just sort of say, like, this fight for citizenship, particularly in the US, right, has always been a Black and indigenous fight, right? And this isn't to say, right, the immigrant rights movement right now, which is a very Latinx movement, right, by and large in the mainstream, that has good reason, right? One, the population of those that are undocumented, the population of those that are migrants, particularly in the South, Southwest, right? But you could see that as a land or a border issue, right? The Treaty of Guadalupe, you know, Mexicans always say that the border crossed them. But I think when we're looking at enforcement, right, detention and deportation, 76% of those that get deported that are Black is because of a criminal conviction. The police, Popo, right? When you look at Jamaica, 93% of those that are getting deported back to the island, right, is because of contact with the NYPD, LAPD, wherever Jamaicans are, right? 86% in, by and large, in the Caribbean, Africa, 82% of Kenyans get deported because of contact with the police, right? So immigrant rights as a large mainstream might be a Latinx issue, but the enforcement part is really a Black issue, right? But this is historic, whether it was the Freedom Papers and the slave catchers or whatever have you, right? The addiction of this country to pull up on Black people with weapons and cages, right, has been for a long time. I won't say for, it's been for centuries, right? And so has the fight for citizenship, okay? The other point that I do want to make, Hamid, you brought up sort of the 1965 Immigration Naturalization Act, right? Which is really important. And in 1965, 82% of immigrants that were coming to the US, again, excluding what's been happening with our Central American brothers and sisters, right? 82% were white people from Europe, right? By the 1990s, when the 1996 laws came in, right, 86% were Black and brown people coming from Africa, Central Asia, and the Caribbean, right? And so what was happening during the 90s, right, which is essentially when Black and brown people were suffering, right, in urban areas, New York, Miami, LA, Congress got together and decided to go to war. We now know it as the war on drugs, right? And when you start to look at the enforcement apparatus of immigration, right, right after that happened 9/11, right? And I also do think that sometimes when we're talking about erasure, sometimes I think that the Muslim narrative also gets lost, right? Folks got to remember that in 2001, Department of Homeland Security when did that pop off? 2003, April, March, right? A lot of these immigration detention centers, one, for example, Etowah in Alabama, was actually built for terrorists, right? That they were going to fill. But then once they found out that it wasn't as an epidemic as they thought that it was, right? They started filling this up with Black and brown bodies, right? And a lot of it, Black people, right, who are locked up for the longest, who are coming from the prison system, right? And so now you have sort of this explosion of detention and deportation. Deportation numbers, we're looking into like, you know, around Bush, at the end of Bush, Obama, about 500,000 people getting deported, right? And so I think to take a step back and to think about that question, right? The erasure of Black migrants in the immigrant rights movement. On one hand, it isn't surprising, right? Black people are always erased, mainly, right, in mainstream movements, right? Whether it is the LGBTQ movement, right? Whether it is, I mean, now the Voting Rights Act, right? When you look, even housing. So a lot of times movements, right, at least in the US, always just so happen to forget about the Black people, right, in which have been a bedrock for it, even the revolution, right? And so I think the term sort of why is it that Black people are being erased in the immigrant rights movement has a lot to do with white supremacy, right? To a level where, you know, the expansion of whiteness sort of in the Latinx community, right, is also sort of a factor. And that's a factor that I can't speak on, right? But I think to just put it plainly, right, America has a race problem, and that problem shows up in any movement that you would want, right? Even into you guys, you know, do police brutality, right? Even in that movement, you could sort of see the switch, right, from I hope there are no children on here, from fuck 12 to defund the police, right? That this is how movements essentially, right? You would almost say that this is its lifespan, right? And so, Hamid, you brought up the nonprofit part about the immigrant rights movement, right? And I think yes, and right, it's also about capitalism, right? Being in these movements, the nonprofit. I mean, here in New York, they employ probably somewhere around a couple 100,000 people, right? We're looking at maybe around $30 billion a year, right? So it's an industry that really gets fed, right, by capitalism. And that also sort of seeps in to the movement as we know it, right? And to just sort of wrap up, I know we're going to keep this conversational, so I'm not going to talk too much sort of on the issue as the erasure of it, right? And I just think that what we need to understand is that this always happens, right? When there's a movement for social, economic, or even political inclusion, right? Black people, right, throughout history have always been sort of become invisible. And I think right now in the immigrant rights movement, it is very convenient to do that, right? Because I think for Black migrants, we understand citizenship is not our goal, right? Where it is for the immigrant rights movement, right? Because we're already denied you know, if you have a felon, right? If you have a felony, I mean, you can't get food stamps, there's no food, housing, right? School, employment. You can't even be, you know, a juror. Why would you want to be a juror? I don't know, but you can't be that, right? And so there is this sort of long, sort of standing, I would say, I mean, erasure. I'll just go back down to that, right? And I think finally, to really just sort of unpack the immigrant rights movement. I mean, I think you have something like yesterday where there was a day without immigrants, and I'm not sure if folks are very familiar with that, right? And Baji really had to take a stand and say no, I thought it was great. I mean, personally, for me, A Day Without Immigrants is almost like saying, like a day without slaves, right? Like this idea that you sort of, our bodies are worth an economic contribution, right? I'm like, whatever, you know? But Baji, on the other hand, that's personal. Don't get me in trouble. But Baji, on the other hand, really just took a stand and said that it divided African Americans, right? And it sort of looked at the work, right? Not understanding that there is this long trope by white supremacists, right? That Black Americans are lazy, right? And don't want to work, right? And then all of a sudden you have sort of this idea that A Day Without Immigrants is sort of, and it was really like economic. It's like, who's going to run your restaurants? Who's going to be able to be out there? And you know, and as you know, if I was Black American, like, not me, you know, better, you know, go find someone else to do it. And I think that our lives are more than just economic contribution. I think our lives is about the livelihood of our families, right? Being able to participate civically and politically in society, and economically, being able to have a life of dignity. So I think, yeah, I think I'll stop there and I'll take questions or whatever you guys got going on. I hope that was helpful.
That was incredibly helpful. Thank you so much. You're sharp at what is it, 9:30 over there? Thank you
All
for
right.
that.
It's cold. I got the stove on, so I'm just getting warm. You know what I mean? So
Yeah, I want to know what's in that coffee.
it's just coffee, Hamid. I'm surprising myself right now.
No, but that's great. And what you shared is so awesome. I wanted to see if you could talk a little bit more on this, sort of this, the effect of reform in this work as well, though, because you talked about how, this sort of immigrant rights movement also was adjacent to and mirrored the freedom and civil rights movement that existed, right? And we know that abolition is not necessarily a new term. We know it in terms of slavery, but also in the 70s, they were talking about prison abolition adjacent to the civil rights movement. So we see now in a lot of the organizing spaces that we're in that reform ends up getting pushed a lot heavier than abolition, and a lot of the, work that we do that's grounded in fighting against anti-Blackness and fighting against the goals that we have as Black migrants, as opposed to the goals that maybe other non-Black immigrant communities have. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more on that and, what that looks like in the work that we do, and also what that's looked like thus far in terms of having to fight against reform rhetoric and more towards rhetoric that advances our missions.
Yeah, no, reform. I mean, I think, listen, you know, they don't call it a struggle for no reason, right? There's a saying that easy streets don't make no riders. So reform, right? I think it's an interesting term because I think about it like right now, you know, we've been saying for a long time, and when Shakir used to live in New York, right? We've been saying that New York City is a police state, right? And now we have the police as mayor, right? And so when this mayor came out with their blueprint to end gun violence, which I think came out maybe, was it at the end of January, right? All of those like bail reforms out the window. You know what I mean? It only took them a paragraph to be like, yeah, that was cute, but we're not going to do it, right? And so I think reforms are something that like you would think of as like a to-do list that you would wake up in the morning and be like, okay, I got to check this off my box, right? And this is what I'm going to do. And I think anything that can be reversed like that, right? I think this is really a problem for grammar and definition, really, because I think that the reform. I'm not going to go and bring out my dictionary, but I really do think that these reforms aren't really reforms at all, right? I think what they are doing is maybe changing, right, some of the landscape, right, to just sort of say, look, this is how we're, we're going to do it differently, right? But not really a transformation is probably the word that I would use, right? Which abolition gives that sort of pathway, right? That route how are we going to transform this system? As opposed to just sort of saying, look, we have an issue here, it's not looking good. And how do we make this look good? Another example, particularly in the immigrant rights movement right now, we're dealing with, I think it's Biden or Mayorkas, who's the head of Department of Homeland Security, right? Now are about to put 400,000 people under house arrest, right? So they're like, well, they're not in prison, right? But it's almost like, it's the arrest part in house arrest that's the problem, right? It's not like you could playground arrest. You could put any word in front of it. That's not what our communities need, right? And what we're really looking for is a situation in which we have the freedom of movement and the freedom to be with our families, right? And so I think the term like reform, right, that is going to be something that we're always going to struggle with. I wish I had a better, I think you used the word concise to describe what I said earlier. I appreciate that. But I think this is where the real struggle really comes in, right? When you really look at it and say, who is this benefiting? I think the way that you guys started this meeting, somebody had read, just about not oppressing other people, right? And I feel like reform kind of has that vibe, right? Where it's really just sort of saying, okay, we're gonna let the non-violent offenders go over the expense of criminalizing and oppressing the violent offenders. Hamid, you brought up good immigrant, bad immigrant, right? All immigrant rights reform has always been, we're gonna like make a reform so that the good immigrants can get it. Deferred action for childhood arrivals, dreamers, shout out to the dreamers. I respect that. I respect their hustle. I respect that what they have done. But again, at the expense of what? Right now they're like in their mid-30s, right? Trying to buy a house and start a family. And so this was a reform that had happened under the Obama administration, right? But really, is it like a win, right? Is it something that everyone benefits? And I refuse to think that to move forward, right, that you have to throw someone under the bus. Like, I think that's a capitalistic lie. And I think the white supremacists are always sort of, because white supremacy had to do that, right? You throw Africans under the bus, you throw indigenous people, like this is how they were able to progress, right, into the situation that they're at now. And so I think that doesn't work for us. That doesn't work for the earth, that doesn't work for our communities, that just doesn't work at all. And I think instead of reform, I'm looking more for transformation, right? And so, yeah, like I said, like, I don't know how y'all deal with that. I'd like to hear some of y'all thoughts on sort of how do you guys sort of deal with reform and how do you navigate it? Because it almost, that is the movement now. And it's so sad that the movement is either like folks say that they're for reform and then other folks say that they're not. And then that just becomes where we're gridlocked at. And instead of being imaginative or creative, to just sort of say, hey, like, let them have that. We know that that's not going to work out, and see if we can actually, build something substantial.
Yeah, thanks so much for that, Abe. And I see somebody's throwing shade at you in the comments. Catch that.
Oh, I know who that is. Don't worry about it.
Well, see, that's a conversation that we want to have. So that's how we want to make it interactive. So yeah. So, but also want to invite other folks if they have any thoughts about what Abe has shared. So, any thoughts or any comments from anybody?
I would like to address this person on the chat though, just before we move. Again, I'm not dissing the dreamers, right? Because it's not. Again, we were in a situation in the movement where they were young, the government turned their back on them, and they wanted to move in that direction. There were those of us who had criminal convictions, such as myself and my family, that felt if they're going to call you guys dreamers, they're going to call us a nightmare, right? And that's when Felons Not Families came about, right? But now I think the dreamers are probably the best people to talk about reform, right? To talk and ask them how, like, how are you doing? Ask them, how are they, how do they feel about it? So anyways, thank you for that.
We have Chela to see you in 1 minute, but just wanted to see if iPhone wants to share a comment.
Yeah, what's up, babe?
What's going on down here?
And everyone. No, I was mostly just joking. It's not even a diss on dreamers. I remember being in college and the movement was happening, and I am a dreamer, but like I think I never identified with it for the reasons you said. And even now I'm always in weird conversations with my family when they're like, yo, Biden will probably do something for y'all. And it's just like, yeah, that's like the easiest thing he can do, and people are just like, yo, don't you love Obama? Because that's like why you're able to work in the country now. And I'm like, yeah, but like that's the easy thing, that's the only thing he did for anybody, right? Like that was the easy thing to do. And so no, I agree. But like, yeah, it's I'm not in the immigrant rights movement, so I'm not sure how divisive of a tactic it is, but I'm sure like it comes up, and I've always kind of stayed away with it because that was never kind of like the identity, like that just was never like kind of like my conspicuous identity. That wasn't the issues that was affecting me and my community growing up. Was like, although there was probably other Black undocumented folks in like my community that I just didn't know, and they didn't know I was Black and undocumented, but that wasn't conspicuously the problem that was affecting me. So it was never the issue that I felt like I was going to get down with. But no, thank you for your thoughts as always, and your jokes and your humor. It's like stand-up hour out here.
Oh, is it? Everyone's on mute. I don't know.
Well, we'll get it going. So, Chela, go ahead.
So, good presentation. I think we have to talk about I think you named this, around the different definitions of reform, right? There's reform as the goal, and there's using reform to get to abolition, right? Like to some folks, prisoners' rights right now is reform, right? I used to be one of those folks that I was like, fuck that, I'm an abolitionist, but then like, what about the inmates that are like literally dying because they are not having adequate access to healthcare, especially trans women not having access to the meds they need, right, to be who they are. So I'm thinking about that. I also, you named LGBT as like you were right. It was hella racist. It's been hella anti-Black. A lot of the movements are still hella anti-Black, real talk, even disability justice. And the biggest thing I find though, is that there's like a rift between folks who are like super intersectional, right? Who want to include disabled folks in the movement, who want to include trans people in the movement, who want to do language justice, who want to do, because there's so much, right? There's just so much to hold. There's a rift between them and other folks that are like, well, we just got to get the work done. You know what I mean? And that also brings in another conversation about who's actually in the movement, right? Like I live in Skid Row, the highest population of policing in the US. Hardly anyone from Skid Row is on this call. Real talk. Hashtag try to keep it real. Hardly any Black trans women are on this call. Hardly any undocumented people from Skid Row, which does exist, are on this call. Who are on this call are a bunch of academics, and let's just be real, the people that have been in the movement spaces for a while. And it's not to say we were never a part of those communities, right? It's just acknowledging that, like, literally, who's doing the work right now? Um, let's see. I think I'm done. Oh yeah. Oh, the good immigrant versus bad immigrant. There's also the good Black person versus a bad Black person narrative, right? The respectable kind of like, I know. I'm just gonna use this as a, well, I'll say the dude from Family Matters instead of Cosby. I'll say that versus, the Black person that's more like a fucking Malcolm X, right? That's a good Black person versus a bad Black. Those are the same narratives. It's the same things that like try to keep rifts in the community, as well as, yeah, just being a trans woman in the movement. It's so disheartening to see so many things. I've been pushed out of so many spaces where white people get celebrated for doing the same exact work or saying the same exact thing. I hope I'm making sense. I'm a little depressed, been depressed for the last 6 months. I'm gonna get ready to get drunk. Chella, I'm a mute. Thank y'all for letting me talk. Thank you, Baba.
Thank you, Chella, of course. Absolutely. Abe, were you going to say something?
Thank you. Really, I mean, that's really, I mean, that I was going to say, I think being more inclusive is like really, really important, and Chella, thank you for that, because I expect that realness, who's doing the work? Great question, right? And I also think that it's like, is it work is really the question, right? When you're looking at spaces in which you might not feel included, this happens to me a lot. Obviously, I think your degrees and your layers are way more deeper, right? But then sometimes I'll just look at it, I'll be like, but this ain't even really work, right? Like, is this space, not this one here, but just in general, right? Because that like, if you're in a space where there's particularly in the nonprofit world or whatever, if you're in a space where there are, let's say, a lot of white people talking about I don't know, housing or whatever have you, right? Is that really work being done, or is that a situation in which there's just people don't want to feel as bad as they did before, right? And so I think we've got to be careful, like you brought up the issue around respectability politics, right? And this thing around representation. Right. And so I think you've answered some of your questions there, because really it was very insightful, right? For you to switch from, I don't really see myself in these spaces, to even these people that are in these spaces are whack and they're lame, right? So there's a lot there where representation might not be, for us, right? Because in that space is a fraud, right? And again, I think you bring up a good question, and that needs to be there. The other thing I do want to say in my last point with that, Chella, because not whack and lame, just privilege. Okay, you're toning it down on the chat. I was matching your energy. Okay, but yeah, but the other thing about reform, though, right? Because I think it might be best for me to take a step back and just sort of explain that I wasn't being facetious when I said war. Okay, the war on drugs, the war on terror, right? This is real, right? Like the war in Afghanistan, there was an evacuation out of Kabul, and everybody knew that the war was over, right? Where is that for the war on drugs? Where is that for the war on Black people? So to me, the war is continuing. And then the question is, what does reform look like in a war? I can't answer that question. I think right now what I'm just trying to say is end the war. Then we can negotiate. Where is the truce? Where is the stalemate? Lay down your weapons, right? Then we can really talk about sort of reform, right? In a real way. And I just think that right now, what's been happening, somebody brought up facial recognition. I brought up house arrest, ankle monitors, whatever have you. So the war still continues, right? And folks are saying, well, reform, right? Which is almost like saying drone attacks is better than actual a fighter plane or whatever have you. I say all of that to say that in my mind, right, my reality, and I think the reality really is that there is a war on Black and brown people and poor people, right? And we're sitting around trying to talk about sort of a reform when there's just an onslaught, right? And I think for me, right, let's talk about a truce. Let's talk about a way where we could say the war is finally ended and negotiations really begin then for peace, not during the war, you know? So I'll end it there. Thank you, Chella. I really appreciate you.
Thank you. Just really good conversation. Just want to read a couple comments. Really enjoying this conversation. Let's see. This is Rebecca. I see reform as a way to expand their control/surveillance, for example, cameras on cops, house arrest, basically more innovative ways to surveil oppressed folks in more discreet ways under the name of reform. So let's, since we are on that, and thank you, Chella, for sharing your thoughts in print as well. So now going to just the history of reform as well. Let's just kind of go there. Let's talk about it. A couple things maybe to set that tone as well. That one of the things, as being just hands-on and very actively involved in the immigrant rights movement, that was always, or most of the time, kind of just as an observation, was that just the one that it was very much built towards appeasement versus demand. And more radical fucking narrative and politics it was infused by, because it was also I would say driven by big labor as well for the longest time. So to the extent that, and my years may be off a little bit, but it wasn't up until the battle in Seattle in 1999 or so till big labor even came out and supported immigrant rights movement. I mean, this wasn't up until up until this time. So that is going on. The third thing I also want to talk about is that because, and this is where, sometimes, and I've thought about the complexity of the statement, that the color of white supremacy and how it takes and what shapes it takes as well, that you don't really have to be a white person to be serving white supremacy as well and in service to and think like that as well, was that for the longest time, that the fight was about, along with appeasement was that we are just asking for an adjustment of status, right? It wasn't about criminalization. It wasn't about the criminality of that, which really then led to, and it was driven by a lot of anti-Blackness. And you would see that within immigrant rights movement and the spaces as well. Because when you brought them in, I remember even before the word crimmigration became sexy and just kind of what's kind of being used as like thrown around, then you were sitting there in these meetings and going like, wait, the first point of contact is with local law enforcement. I don't see INS raids like, at that time INS. Or ICE raids as well. Yes, they are happening, but the first point of contact is with the criminal justice system. That's what puts people into deportation. That's what gets people but yet at the same time, a complete rejection of criminalization because it's them, it's those people. So that narrative was driving a lot of these reform movements as well. So I want to share something over here. This was an article that came out was written in the New York Times in 2014. And what's interesting about this article is that it says, and this was that over the past decades, these donors have invested more than $300 million in immigrant organizations. Right. So now so you have Ford Foundation, Carnegie Corporation, Open Society, Atlantic Philanthropies, and we know these players. You've been in the immigrant rights movement for a minute, and how and what they do. And before that, there's always a lot of money that was going in as well. So here's what I want to draw these and build this up to. That 1986, when we saw immigration reform and the Simpson-Mazzoli bill, it was driven by what? What came through was employer enforcement, employer sanctions. So now enforcement regime has started, where more than the adjudication regime or the comprehensive immigration reform, this is setting the foundation for the comprehensive enforcement regime. And then throughout that, what we saw in the early 90s, then you started seeing these groups like National Immigration Forum out there, which then, and then what you see now as America's Voice. Then you saw local organizations like in Los Angeles, and you are in New York, but CHIRLA, for example, the Coalition for Humane Immigrant Rights for Los Angeles, and various other organizations. And you would sit there and you would watch them, and especially, and then it came to a head when McCain-Kennedy bill was introduced in 2006, which was the first time that the words comprehensive immigration reform were being used as well. And then later on, up until 2012, the conversations became that these corporations and foundations are releasing monies to nonprofits based upon what sort of legislative advances are they making. So it wasn't a fight for fundamental human rights. It wasn't a fight to look at what was going on at least in the current iteration of immigrant rights movement of migrants from Africa. It was this rush towards like wrapping it up in a very appeasing narrative. It was like, just giveaways to border security. It was this whole thing that led to that whole bill. And I think this was back in 2006 when the double fencing bill. So the fence on the border is not Trump's idea. Trump basically built it on that playbook that a legislation was passed in 2006, which was known as a double fence bill act, which meant that the 700-mile border, they were going to construct a fence out there. So these were all compromises, and these were all giveaways that, and there's much more to be said, so I'll stop there. But I just wanted to hear, from you as somebody who's on the front lines of the immigrant rights movement, that how was the role of these nonprofits? What was the role of the foundations, and how did these national organizations really play a part where the more radical tradition of migrant rights that had been going on for centuries in the United States got completely deflated and got completely shifted towards this reform, as we are talking about, which then looked like more fences, more border surveillance, expansion of border patrol, leading to the Department of Homeland Security, and on and on and on.
Well, you're right about that, on and on and on, because I mean, it could, the list is forever, right? You the nonprofit, I know you're coming for my check right now, so I'm gonna try to do best. I mean, it's a pretzel day at my daughter's school, but yeah, I mean, I work for nonprofits. Let me just be open about that. Hopefully what I say doesn't have me going to LA looking for a job from you, Hamid. Yeah, I mean, 300 million in that article, it's funny because I was like, that's it? They only gave 300 million? Because really, if you look at it, even outside of the let's take like nonprofits that work in housing, right? And if you see who gets employed by these nonprofits, who's on the board, who's on staff, right? That makeup are the same folks gentrifying communities, right? Where you got Chella out there freezing in Skid Row, you know what I mean? So the way this works, right, is Black people will always sort of like be on sort of the bottom. And the only way, right, that any type of movement will be acceptable to white America is if Black people are not in that movement. Okay, so with the immigrant rights sort of case study that we're talking about, like right now, right? I think when you look at those that fund, right? And where do they get their money from? I mean, essentially, one can make an argument that it is just a laundering facility for the financial district in New York, right? If one wants to look at it that way. I'm trying to be very, very generous right now. And so, it's almost like taking a step back and that's why I said earlier, I was like, I get it, the nonprofit. I work for one, and hopefully this won't, it won't affect it. But really, it's capitalism and profit, right? And so when you're thinking about reform or movements in that way, unless you have an anti-capitalist ideology, right, you're going to be co-opted, right? They're going to make a business out of this. They're going to make an industry, which isn't, an anomaly when it comes down to Black bodies, right? There was an industry in slavery, and then they moved on, made an industry in prison, and now they're going to move on and make an industry in electronic surveillance, right? And so I think that if we're trying to combat it, right, we need to, one, name it what it is, as you so eloquently gave out I can't name names like you did, but you gave out that list right there, right? And the story's the same. And the narrative is always going to be the same, right? Is that folks that are into this business of helping out poor Black and brown people, right, are paying their mortgages, right? Their kids are going to private school, right? And as long as there's a problem, as long as me and my family are still in projects or still in housing, right, the situation is always going to sort of be there. And I just don't think that that structure, right, that structure that you just sort of described, right, is not a structure for justice. It's not a structure to give ourselves dignity, right? It is a structure to make sure that people can buy houses in Black neighborhoods, right? People can still lock us up whenever that they want to. And as far as, let's say, like, how do we address that, right? And I think the root of it is capitalism. But you also brought up other points that I really just kind of like, I feel like I want to just make a note on. I mean, I think you brought up the three, you know, you were like, there's appeasement level, there's big labor, and I think you brought out colorism, right? And I think appeasement and colorism, I could just like wrap that up together, right? I mean, I think I'm assuming you use the word anti-Blackness and really trying to say that the immigrant rights movement is anti-Black, right? Yeah, 100%. Don't go to sleep thinking it's not. And really, if you look at sort of the legislation that you had brought up, right? You were looking at like sort of immigration legislation. I mean, we could go back to Supreme Court cases, right? In which, was it a Japanese fella that tried to argue that he was white so that he could become a citizen, right? You're looking.
It was Indian, Bhagat Singh, yeah.
Okay, it was all right, but your people, I don't know.
no, just kind of sharing that.
Okay, all right, your people, you know, try to make that move. I see that move all the time, you know, and that's all right, you know, in the sense that I'm not gonna get caught up in that feeling. Like, I get it. Everyone wants to get out of the shit that we're living in, right? And colorism has always been the quickest route out of it, right? And so in the immigrant rights movement, it is the same way, right? Even if you're looking, I mean, there's a term out there that's called, you know, what is it? White Tinos and white Tinas, right? In the Black community, right? We've gone through this before. And so I think that appeasement and that colorism part is definitely important in the immigrant rights movement because it is so based and centered on race and always has been, right? And so who was that? The Japanese person. There you go. Ozawa. That's who I was thinking. It's a whole crew. There's a squad as deep. But yeah, but the point just really by sort of saying that I think that appeasement is really important and it's different for Black migrants, right? When I came here, I'm gonna date myself in the 80s. It wasn't the white America that I was assimilating or integrating to, it was into Black America, right? And I think for Black migrants, and that's that, you know, like Dami earlier, the iPhone, right? So conspicuous, right? But when he was like, people didn't know I was Black and undocumented, which is true, right? Because we have to assimilate and integrate into Black America, right? As opposed to someone who is from Central America or is Asian, right? Clearly, immediately, people are gonna be like, oh, you're not from here, you don't really belong, you're a foreigner, in that same sense. But for Black migrants, it's like once we dip in, automatically, within 5 minutes, we carry the history of 500 years of slavery immediately, right? And so it is important for us to understand how these freedom movements in the United States worked, right? Whether it was the first Civil Rights Act in 1886 that gave us the 14th Amendment, in which all of us who are born here are citizens now, right? But I wouldn't even, you know, immigrant rights movement don't really bring up the 14th Amendment, right? Because there's a Black freedom movement history. The 1965 Act that you brought up, I brought up. That was during the civil rights movement in which folks were challenging white supremacy, right? And so I think right now, when we're looking at it, outside of reforms, right, looking at the war that we are in, if you guys can sort of entertain that thought for a hot second. And if you can, there's a problem. But really to just sort of kind of consolidate it in a way, right? Yes, there is money to be made in this, and that's just capitalism, right? And I think going at the nonprofits is a good way, right? To really show, because they're doing it in the name of the betterment of those that are poor, Black and brown, right? And then colorism, you have that. And then labor, obviously, there's not a whole lot to really kind of say about that, just that the history of this country has always bound Black and brown bodies to labor. And then if we can't do labor, we either get locked up or they kill us, which is really, really dirty. But anyways, I'll stop there. Thank you, Hamid. On and on and on, you know what I mean? But that was a lot you said, and I hope that some of the points that I made were valuable.
No, thank you, definitely, and thank you, Tian, for adding that information as well. So just wanted to see if other folks have any thoughts and comments about what we are talking about, just the whole complicity. And the wholesale selling out of the immigrant rights movement as well, that here we are in 2022, and back to the best thing that has happened is DACA. If you really think about it, that, in the context of reform or whatever it means. So any other thoughts, any other questions that come to people?
I just had a question. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes, we can. If you can speak up just a little bit more. So yeah.
Yeah. Just the question of how, just based on everything that I've been hearing, and how Abraham was mentioning the Day Without Immigrants, how it's just tying the person to, what, like, the capitalist society and what they can contribute, along with like all of the colorism and everything. Can it tie back to the whole central idea, and I say idea because I don't believe it per se, but of the American dream, of trying to catch a reality that you really can't get, because I mean, the way that I've heard it and I've seen it, like this American dream, it's, if you follow this step and this step and this step, you'll get there, but you never really quite get there. And you really can't get there the way that I see it. I think it all kind of ties back to it.
Yeah.
Thank you, Carla. Yeah, go ahead, Abe.
No, thank you. Well, thank you so much, Carla. I appreciate that. About the American dream. I mean, I don't know. It's like Peloton in a way. Everybody wants to be fit, but it ain't gonna work like that. I mean, it's hard for me to talk about American dream because I mean, like, I feel like I said, like, Black America, like when we got in, we just knew, we were like, oh, hey, there's a war, right? And so I think, yeah, that one's a really good question. I mean, personally for me, I just sort of feel that we can make that ours, right? And I think that the American dream isn't really working out. It ain't even working out for white people, and that's why that white, there's white supremacists who are like being open about it. That's why white people feel discomfort, right? Is because the American dream isn't really working out, and I think when you're looking at the critical race theory fight in school, right? Basically to teach Happy Black History Month, by the way. Okay. You know what I mean? Trying to teach Black history or whatever have you, right? I think, to me, I like, Carla, I would ask, like, what's your dream? You know what I mean? Like, what do you want out of life?
Well, I mean, I'm not quite sure. Because the way, when I was growing up, I grew up with seeing my mom and my tia, like the struggle, like, of them working hard, of them studying to get that citizenship. But even so, like, even helping them. I was in elementary school, but even seeing how hard they were trying, and you know, really trying to understand what is it that they're trying for. Like they're already being successful in what they can do. They already have the skills that they do. So like, well, to me, it was more of like, okay, you get this done, and then what? I mean, there has been really no significant changes, except the fact that now they have security to stay, um, you know. But in terms of us getting out of poverty, or you know, magically becoming like everybody that is 100% American, to say, there really is no changes. And so it just, you know, like the questions, I guess it's more of like, how do we, especially for me, because I'm really like, I like to be involved in like the schools in my area. So how, and especially with like the parents, how do we shift that mentality of, you know, because all these higher institutions, even school, you know, like the central idea that you need school to succeed, and who can get into these schools and the prices that you have to pay to get this education. How do you shift that ideology, you know? Because I think most of the time you think of who's successful in history and it's all these white men. It really kind of gives you a, okay, so how do I fit into all of that? Especially in communities of color, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't worry about, I mean, you fit in right now, you fit in on this call, you know, in this space. I think that, you know, shout out to your Tia and the whole fam working really hard. Like to me, you know, I think my idea of the American dream is that you guys, you know, would feel stable and feel safe, you know, and feel like, you know, you're in a position that all that work that you put in, you see that work, right? And you can be like, yeah, this is what we did, even though they're always trying to knock that down. And so, you know, and your last question is, how do we shift that mentality? That's such a great question. I think that that's a question for everybody, right? I might answer it. I know I was talking shit about Peloton, but anyways, the point really was about how individuals, right, transform society, right? And so if you yourself are going through some transformation, whether it's political, right, which it seems like, then I would probably say, you know, that's how we do it. Whatever you're doing, right, is how we do it.
Thank you.
Carla.
Thank you, Carla. Thank you, Abraham. Chris, go ahead, and I'm going to pass it back to Meraki.
Cool. Hello, everyone. I'm Chris. Appreciate everyone here on this call. I just wanted to go on a little bit about the whole like dreamer / DACA narrative that came about, and how I thought it was extremely like foundational in terms of supporting the neoliberal narrative and like the neoliberal like goal of kind of just created this foundation of being able to be like, oh, well, you now could be a doctor, you now have the foot of the table, you now have that fake representation that doesn't do anything. So there's always something that citizens and most even immigrants alike have always pointed at to that, like, oh, well, you have a dream already, like you could be a doctor, you could be a lawyer, you could be this. It's just like there's always something to point to, so that it even pushes down like organizers and activists that want structural changes to be like, oh, stop complaining, oh, stop, just work hard, just keep doing that. So it's worked so well that it's been like, what, more than 10 years that, and it's still like, there's still DACA, just do it every 2 years, just be the good citizen every 2 years. And I think that was the main goal of creating DACA, just to like maintain that neoliberal like stance and kind of just like, to like, kind of just like enforce their reality, what they really want to accomplish is just like representation and like false like diversity, whether any structural change. And I think it's working successfully. And I think anyway, fuck dreamers, I'm a dreamer.
Okay, thank you so much. Thanks for having my back. I'm like, all right, somebody pull it up for me. No, I appreciate that. And I never thought about it that way, Chris. Like I never made the connection that it's like, first of all, like the struggle that you go through, right? Because everybody's gonna be like, "Oh, you're a dreamer." I might have been one of those before you spoke on it. And you're right, right? Because actually, like you are the like manifestation of how the immigrant rights movement is failing, right? In a real way, is you did everything, you're still here, right? Um, and you know, Black people go through that a lot. We go through that all the time, you know. I know from a personal experience that, you know, I had gotten picked up for a robbery and ended up in Rikers, not for too long, but I had a job, I had a home, I was in grad school, right? And I'm like, yo, I'm doing everything you want me to do as a person in America. But then to end up in a situation where you're out on bail for 6 months and whatever have you, right? And I think for me, that became, you know, sort of a part of my political awakening, Chris. And I feel like you're actually in the throes of that too, because you're right. Like they played you, right? And they played you because like sometimes I don't feel that I might have to get too close to that dreamer narrative, right? But maybe I do because you're over here being like, you know, hey, it's not that easy and we're still struggling and none of this stuff, they just gave me a piece of paper, essentially.
Yeah. And then one thing I forgot to say is that what we talk about in the coalition a lot is that it is a counterinsurgency tactic, I feel like, you know, for like me to ever even want to like rise up and like do some shit because I'm now afraid to like lose my job, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And then, and also like other myself from like other immigrants that can't get a job or can't like, you know, because they've been like system impacted before. So, and like, once again, you know, like it is at the core of it is the criminalization that, and like the fight, you know, against criminalization that primarily, you know, started against with the Black movement. So I appreciate you.
No, you're right. You're right about the neutralizing of like, I never thought about that way, but yeah, like they just neutralize y'all. And it's funny because it's the youth, which is where the most energy for any movement really, you know, really kind of comes from, at least when we're thinking about revolutions or whatever. So that, yeah, they're just like, look, this part of your army is now on the injured list.
Yeah,
Thank you, man. I appreciate you.
cool.
Okay. Well, you know, thanks so much for engaging us, Abraham, and thanks everyone for all of the great, insightful questions and commentary that you had throughout this first part of the discussion. Yeah, you've really helped, you know, open up this discussion more and really just give us this great insight on this history of the erasure of Black migrants and how that all connects to these different layers of issues that we're facing in the immigrant rights movement. So thank you. We want to give you the grace.
Oh no, yeah, no, thank you guys. I know you guys got me riled. I was 10. What am I gonna do out here? No, I appreciate that. Thank you so much. Yeah, Meraki, just a pleasure always working with you. Hamid, shout out to everyone that had a question and thank you for help. You know, it was all revealing and illuminating, as I should say. Shout out to Shakir. What's up? And I think Francis is on here too, sneaking up on the person. All right, you guys. Have a good night. Stay warm. All right. Peace. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Talk to you
Peace
soon.
out, man.
All right. And so now we're going to spend just a little bit of time. Well, I'll talk about criminalization a little bit and pass it to my comrade Kim as well. But thanks again to everyone for engaging, you know, in that first half. And so, yeah, you know, we talked already about the fact that, you know, there's an ongoing war on Black people, right? And it's a war that continues in very much so in the form of criminalization and in the system of crimmigration, right? And so, again, I think Hamid said this earlier as well, and it's really no secret that police are often the first contact, right, that a lot of Black people have in general, and then Black immigrants have in this sort of deportation system and this system of crimmigration, right? And so we know through our research experience and documentation, right, and reports that have come out that more than 1 out of every 5 non-citizens who are facing deportation on criminal grounds before the Executive Office of Immigration Review is Black, right? It's Black people, and Black immigrants are facing the highest deportation and incarceration levels, right? Incarceration levels. And so with this knowledge, we're also aware of the fact that, it's 76% of Black immigrants who are being deported because of over-policing and racial profiling that exists in Black communities. And it just really highlights the fact that local police are some of the biggest feeders into the detention and deportation systems. Again, the same racist policing that incarcerates non-immigrant Black people in America also affects and detains and incarcerates Black people who are immigrants, right? We are shared in that experience, right? We share that experience very much. We're likely, Black immigrants are more likely to be incarcerated by ICE because of this racial profiling by local police, right? And so it's funny that we call it immigration detention because it's really just immigration incarceration as well, right? There's no difference between these walls. I mean, if you go to downtown LA, the Metropolitan Detention Center is no different from, the other sort of holding cells that they have for people with criminal offenses as well, right? And so we can't sort of ignore the fact that the work that police do to criminalize our communities is synonymous with the work that ICE and DHS and even CBP, right, does to criminalize migrants as well. Once they've even been inside of the system, right? Once you find Black immigrants inside of the systems, we are 6 times then more likely to be locked in solitary confinement while in detention. So an additional criminalization is put on top of our bodies as soon as we're inside of these detention centers and prison cells as well, right? It's pretty obvious then that there's a direct attack on our communities, right? And that this is all based on anti-Blackness, right? At the core of the immigrants' struggle and at the core of Black struggle is anti-Blackness, because at the end of the day, that's what fuels white supremacy and the white supremacist systems that exist as well. I won't speak too much on criminalization because I do want to give Kim a chance to speak as well. But there's a few things that need to be highlighted in terms of people with intersectional identities that are having to be, especially targeted in this realm of criminalization and crimmigration. But it's also important to note that a lot of the Black immigrants who have been dealing in sort of the crimmigration system and are at risk of deportation for criminal conviction have often lived in the US for a very, very long time, right? And they've established these strong community ties, right? Have probably had generations of families now living in the US and are often stopped by the police in things like traffic stops or, maybe they had a bar fight or something and then the police were called and now they're, being apprehended and placed in deportation proceedings, sometimes long after some criminal, event, so-called criminal event or conviction had occurred, right? And so we're seeing that these more vulnerable populations, right, like undocumented and underdocumented people are now being put in, a position where they're at risk of deportation, right? And we see these in even more marginalized communities, like people who may have, precarious statuses and are in domestic violence situations, right? They may not have access to resources or support and are now facing criminalization and arrest when they defend themselves maybe for their abuser. We see that in the, in the case of Amria Shafa, right? Who is a Black migrant woman who was convicted of murdering her abusive husband, right? And was not being given the resources that she needed to really make it through this system, right? We also see this for Black migrant children and youth who are experiencing, maybe child, abuse in some form of way, right? And the child may be undocumented or their parents or guardians might be undocumented, right? And they're now put in even greater risk of having to deal with these systems, right? And of course, we can't forget the fact that the trauma of migration itself can have such a great weight on our community members, right? The trauma of migration, anti-Black racism, misogynoir, trans misogynoir, right? And homophobia as well can sometimes mean that Black immigrants are living with mental health issues that put them in situations where police are called on them, right? And then they experience violence and arrests, imprisonment, and psychiatric units in the process. And oftentimes they end up facing death, right, at the hands of police, all right? And we see that in the case of Yassin Muhammad and Isaac Hayden, right, were Black immigrants who were facing mental health crises and were met with the violence of police instead of being met with resources, right? And so because these issues, right, of homophobia, transphobia are layered with anti-Black racism, right? And because Black queer migrants, especially those who are undocumented or underdocumented, are forced into being unhoused and are forced into sort of underground economies, right? Forced into sex work in some instances, or choose sex work for survival in some instances, right? Makes them vulnerable to interactions with police, right? Makes them vulnerable to surveillance of police by police, and subsequently, results in their arrests, which further results in detention, imprisonment, right, and then deportation. And I want to give Kim a chance to speak a bit more on that, but all of this is really to say that there's an incredible amount of investment that is going into criminalizing Black communities, right? Regardless of so-called crime rates, right? Regardless of what we do for the economy, right? Which we already know is nonsense and doesn't really have anything to do with our inherent value as human beings. Just at the end of the day, we're seeing that when we get more money for police, when we get more money for DHS, we see more displacement, more violence, and more detriment of our communities, right? And more deportations as well. So Kim, I'm going to let you speak a little bit more on this sort of idea of intersectionality in the criminalization of immigrants and the most marginalized in our community.
Let me pull up my screen. I need visuals, y'all. I have ADHD, so I cannot just free range anything. Okay, so I wanted to start off with thinking about incarceration, detention, and really any form of criminalization and detainment as kind of like a process of gender violence. And really beginning with Assata Shakur and her autobiography, right, where she talks about how she was incarcerated in a men's prison and placed in solitary confinement for her own protection. And this is the practice commonly done to trans people who are both incarcerated and in detention. But it's very interesting the way that misogynoir works, where her Blackness basically denied her gender as a woman. So she was sent to a men's prison right from the beginning of her conviction. And also just talking about, right, people who are interrupting respectability politics. And I just wanted to call on Janice Gutierrez, who's a trans Latina activist, who interrupted Obama's speech at the Pride reception and calls for the release of all trans people in detention. And she was booed by all the white gays in presence, of course, right, because she was bringing up these uncomfortable truths. And someone that I didn't include a picture of, but also remembering Sylvia Rivera, trans activist also, right, interrupting Pride to call on LGBTQ activism toward their detained and incarcerated community members, right? Because as Abraham so eloquently was explaining, we always, movements are always inherently anti-Black, and the LGBT Gay Liberation Front, right, trans liberation isn't an exception to that. And just the different ways, right, that women, gender non-conforming people, trans people, and sex workers are criminalized every day. And I have both examples of folks who were incarcerated and folks who were detained and deported, because I feel like, as Abraham and Meraki were saying, it's all under the carceral state, right? These are all still punishments where people are disappeared. So Cece McDonald's, right, a Black trans woman who was criminalized for defending herself against a group of white people who were harassing her. Nan Hyu Jo, an undocumented South Korean woman and survivor of domestic violence, criminalized for taking her child away from their abuser. The most recent one, Catalina, who was placed in a unit for men where she faced verbal, physical, and sexual abuse from both detainees and guards. And Catalina was part of kind of this campaign where trans women and other folks from the LGBTQ community that were detained wrote letters, right, denouncing the treatment of ICE in detention centers during COVID. And it was no incident that her case, along with this other trans woman named Emma and this gay man, all three of their cases they weren't granted asylum, right, because they spoke out against her conditions. Monica Jones, a Black trans woman, accepted a ride home and was charged with manifesting prostitution, right? And this is an offense that is referred to as walking while trans, or walking while trans and Black, right? Because if you're walking as a Black person, you're seen as already a criminal. Walking while trans already brings in other dimensions and layers of gender, sexuality, which dictate assumptions about, work. And whether they were an actual sex worker or not, right, that's not the point. The point is that this charge, manifesting prostitution, was placed onto her because she accepted a ride home. Trans people in detention in 2015, ICE wrote a memo that trans people held by ICE need access to mental health treatment, hormone therapy, and should be housed according to their gender identity, right? And none of these things are respected. There's been several cases where trans Latinas and trans Black women die at the hands of detention centers because of lack of access to hormone therapy, abuse and assault, but also some of their HIV status, right, escalates their precarity to COVID. LGBTQ people are 97 times more likely to be victimized within detention centers, right? 97 times, that's fucking wild. And the pandemic has intensified, right, these vulnerabilities because everyone's under lockdown. Folks can't leave if they have a cellmate as an aggressor, for example. So it's both thinking about how the state infiltrates into our communities, right? And makes things like transphobia happen because these are just a result of colonization and enslavement. And just thinking about our present moment, right? And thinking about how no one's disposable. When the COVID-19 pandemic happened, The Guardian reported that people in detention centers, sorry, I can't see, who complained about the lack of sanitary protocols were sent to segregation, and segregation is just another form of solitary confinement for detention centers. So there's just so many layers, right, that we can think about when it comes to criminalization. Anti-Blackness dictates everything from fat phobia to transphobia, right? Scholars have written about how transphobia comes from anti-Blackness and his anxiety to not fit into the categories of Christian morality on gender. So Meraki, your discussion about everything stemming from anti-Blackness is really instrumental, right? If we want to think about the different layers that then are added onto Black people and other communities of color, whether it be their transness, their ability or disability, their HIV positive status, right? All of these things, especially now in our moment, are really heightening our lifespans. Any questions, discussions?
So yeah, I wrote it in the chat, sorry, was someone gonna speak? Oh, I thought I heard feedback. But yeah, people who, thank you for sharing that, Kim. That was, very well thought out, and, you know, had a lot of good consideration in terms of like what it means to be trans and to have intersectional identities and to have to be criminalized as well, and then further be criminalized through the immigration system. But yeah, I failed to mention as well, people with disabilities have an added set of obstacles that they have to face when having to deal with criminalization as well. A lot of times disabilities aren't necessarily immediately seen, right? So that could be mental disabilities that the police just view you, in one perspective that doesn't see you as the whole person that you are. And then that can lead to further criminalization and violence that goes against you, right? We've seen a lot of videos of people in, again, mental health crises that lead to violence and arrest instead of support and resources, right? But also further than that, people with physical disabilities who are left, maybe, unhoused and on the streets, or just without, the proper resources needed, and then get further criminalized because of, the lack of resources that lead them to being in poverty, right? And we know that poverty is intensely criminalized as well. So I wanted to thank you for sharing that. And I know Nee was going to share a little bit as well about the good and bad immigrant narrative, and talk to us a bit more about what it means to see a lot of anti-Blackness in the in the different organizing worlds that we see as well, and how that informs further violence and oppression of immigrant communities.
Thanks, Maraki, and thanks, Kim, as well. And just to piggyback from what the last point that Kim was also talking about, or the fact that you all were also uplifting like the ableism that takes place, right, within that, and just thinking like the clearest example that like I could see in like the clearest manifestation of like the ableism that takes place when we are talking about immigrants is like the term prevention through deterrence, which is something that is often brought up as well through like the physical border, and how like the border, right, it's physically it's not able to go through the entire like the so-called border from like so-called Mexico and the US, or the so-called US as well, but how like the border is enforced, or the border is placed in areas that it's easier for folks to come through. And so that's also something to really consider when you're thinking about like the how like our intersectional identities also play a huge role, because what does the American empire tell you when they are designing this, right? It reminds me of crime prevention through environmental design, which is also something like in the projects, right? You can't have bushes, you can't have trees or shrubs or green spaces, because it's gonna, at least in the settler colonies, in their perspective, they need to have a clear view of people. And so similar to the border, how it's designed specifically to make sure that people that are physically able to go through the treacherous journey of the border without having the resources such as water, such as things that you would need alongside this journey. And so how that often is something that's reinforced. And so I think a lot about like, as far as like the ableism as well, like which folks are as far as like through our structures are desired within immigration as well. And so it reminds me about like the good and the bad narrative, and the role that plays of like who's worthy of being identified, or who's being worthy of being recognized by the American empire. And so I think that that's also something to really consider. And so I really enjoyed the conversations about like the dreamers as well, and like the like understanding the tactics as well, and how like it's been utilized to it's being utilized to like be able to gather and gain like certain rights while throwing other people in the bus. And so I feel like that's a huge tactic, and I feel like it's a result of the colony where folks are like struggling and trying to be able to like be recognized, and to like not be constantly looking behind their backs. And so how that often it gets utilized, and it's a tool that that the settler colony kind of it bets on. And so someone also had mentioned as well, like the reason, what is the American dream, and why why are folks continue to like play into these narrative. And I feel like that's also part of the importance of like American exceptionalism and the those kind of ideologies that have been ingrained through, like, whether it's through propaganda, whether that's through our education system, whether that's through just our social interactions with folks, how we have to think of people as being worthy of like having water and having shelter, and being able to be in a relatively or like safe space, when you're talking about like lands that are looted, and like how it's similar as well, like the immigration and this whole strife to citizenship, and understanding like people are struggling, but how it gets it's often through like reforms, and it's often through like kind of just propping ourselves up, and I feel like that the nonprofit role that plays a huge, or the nonprofits that play a huge role into that as well. And so that's some of the things that I kind of was thinking about. And I know someone had also mentioned like the house arrest as well, and so the different tactics that are utilized to be able to kind of to continue criminalizing folks, and through like reform tactics of being under house arrest instead of being in detentions, but the conversations as well, like, why do we have to legitimize ourselves? Why do we have to conform and be worthy of being recognized when we're talking about like when we're talking about an empire that it's not based on immigrants, it's based on folks that were trying to loot territories. And so I think that that's an important framework of it as well. And then as far as like the surveillance and the technology as well, like the role of Border Patrol and being able to surveil and have jurisdictions within 100-mile radius or 100 miles within the borders. And so that physically takes up the majority of the so-called US. And then in like Texas, the technology that's being implemented and experimented on to have these essentially robot dogs that are going and patrolling and acting as like our surveillance in the borders, that are experimenting, and also have the for example, rifles. And so all of these tactics and all of these different ways in which we continue to well, specifically the settler states continues to utilize a lot of resources, whether it's through like the criminalization of our communities, whether it's through the prison system, the policing system, or the police state, or immigration, because they all utilize taxpayer money. And so it's utilizing the funds that a lot of our communities don't have, but are coerced into giving the settler states. And we don't have really a say, or most folks in the community aren't even aware of what their money is being utilized, but how it's not through a form of like considering the vast majority of us and what the community's needs are. But specifically, it wasn't consent that a nation was being established. And so I think that that's a really key part of it. So we could never really talk about the settler nation as one of consent, and one that is going to be thinking about our well-being, because it was not one with consent to begin with. So until we get to the roots of that, until we get to the roots of the history, and the tools that like divide and conquer, and the ways in which yeah, the ways in which it continues to target certain folks in our communities, and divide our communities in order to just be recognized by the settler states to not struggle as much. And so that's also not to say, yeah. And then just one last thing as well about just like the anti-Blackness that does exist in within brown spaces, but also within like the immigrants inside the immigrant rights movement and the cooptation and the ways in which like we're thinking about it as a single issue without considering how like we don't live single issued lives. And so if you're not also thinking about the ways like that intersectionality and our different identities play a role in it, we're not really doing our communities justice, because our communities don't, even within like so-called Latinos, we're not a monolith as well. And so considering ways in which we both dismantle, but also the ways in which we kind of refuse their those tactics of being able to like give in a little to get like a small little piece of the pie. And I'll pass it on to Hamid to speak a little bit more about border surveillance as well. And Maraki, if you want to speak maybe a little bit more about what this looks like on the grounds and how surveillance has been utilized to surveil folks.
Sorry for that talk about technology. I actually first selected Meraki's name and then I went to meeting everyone. Thank you, Nina. Thank you, Kim. So since we are on this subject as well, just wanted to, and folks may have seen this. So this showed up the other day in the news, that how Border Patrol is now testing these robot dogs on the border. So that's where it's let's see. I can't remember the name of the company right now, but these are the kind of technologies now. And the reason I want to bring it up is that is something that we've always talked about, is that how Skid Row, where we are based out of, is a laboratory for testing all the technologies. So similarly, when we look at the border as well, that is a site for testing a whole lot of different types of technologies. I had I would say the privilege, and really just was a very, very, very just like an experience that I had twice. That I joined a group and we were invited to walk through Sonora Desert. It's about a 78-mile journey from Cesa Bay, Mexico to Tucson, and just in honor of the Migrant Trail, in honor of people who are losing their lives crossing the border, who are crossing the desert. On annually, about 300 people die, and many of the folks over there just don't just give up and go back. And what the main reason for that walk was to really understand, just and bring to life and to really just kind of share the story, and happen to also go to after just looking at, and it was pretty harsh. I mean, the whole situation, and there was. What really kind of blew my mind away was that as we were leaving Cesa Bay, Mexico, we were at a church and the pastor was giving his blessings. And one of the things he shared with us was that now, because more women are also migrating through this border, so it's become a tradition now that because of high cases of sexual assault, women are now advised to take birth control pills. And, you're sitting there in this church and listening to this story, the pastor is sharing this story, and you're kind of just trying to place yourself just as a member of the family or a friend or somebody that, somebody you're there with in the community, and they're getting ready to leave. And you're asking them that, did you remember to take your birth control pills? Because you may get sexually assaulted. So the conditions on the ground that are created are there to degrade life. I mean, the United States has always been, migration has been the primary, piece for social engineering. So social engineering is not about shifting demographics and this, that, and the other, but also what are the ways that, you completely degrade life and to make a point. And then as we were crossing through Sonora Desert, you start looking at various technologies that are installed over there. You look at these cameras that the Israelis, in partnership with Boeing company, has supplied. Then when you get to the U.S. side of the border, that's when some of the earlier versions. This was in mid 2000s. Earlier versions of facial recognition technology, earlier versions of license plate readers, earlier version, by this time, more advanced versions of CCTVs and all of that. The more advanced versions now of the biometric technology as well, where this is the identity domain system, where they were also by this time, we found out that they were testing what they were calling that IDS2, which is identity domain system, which was the next step of retina testing. But this was like how they were looking at the gait, how people walk through these systems as well. So the border has been very much a site of militarization. We talk about border militarization and what it means inland as well. That we talk about that almost 220 million people around the United States live within 100 miles of the border, which remains the territory that Customs and Border Patrol can go in and stop and check anybody's status as well. Not that they stop within those or outside of those ranges as well. But just wanted to throw that and see if people have any thoughts. And I'm sorry, Isaiah, I noticed your hand went up. Then I was in the middle of that flow. But let's just go to you and see if what comments and thoughts you wanted to share. I guess you're sort of muted because can't hear you. No, still can't hear you. If you want to post your comment in chat. Do you want to try without headphones? Oh, there you go.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I was just saying that I did post it in chat. So I believe the robots were made by Boston Dynamics. And then relating to that also, I don't know if you've seen this, but I think it was the Netherlands that they've been using like these sound cannons to prevent people from Africa immigrating over there. That was another thing I want to bring up.
Right. The version of the long-range acoustic devices, they were also, very much present as well. And this robot technology that we were looking at, this is a next stage of that technology. If you all remember in 2016, when Dallas Police Department used these robots to carry this I think it was a bomb or something that or an advanced version of tear gas that was used to go into somebody who was barricaded. And then the Los Angeles Police Department, or maybe it was a sheriff's department, is also known to have used these kind of robot dogs as well. So this kind of technology that we are seeing now is very much in the rise as well. Shakir, were you going to make a comment?
I was going to say, didn't they use some kind of robot or drone like that during the Chris Dorner? Actually, to
yes,
Chris Dorner, like over in the he was holed up. Yeah,
they did.
Attached, I think, to like some kind of drone or robot. Yeah,
definitely. So, any other thoughts and questions on what Kim was sharing or what Nina was talking about, the whole good immigrant versus bad immigrant? I remember more recently during post-Trump's election, there was the county was going to allocate a certain amount of money for bail and some other things as well. And the big debate came that whether they should be supporting people who have gang enhancements attached as well or not. So that's where this whole dialogue, people are put in deportation, people are in jail, but here's the immigrant rights movement having a debate that whether they have gang enhancements or not. So, Akhil?
Yeah, I just have a quick question for any of the presenters. I don't know if Abraham is still on or if Maraki wants to speak to this, but I'm just curious about how the issue of criminalization of Black immigrants how like even the process of people being forced to migrate here like relates to imperialism, and also why when we think about imperialism driving immigration, I mean, I know a little bit more about like what's happening with Central America, but or what's happened, but I just don't really know that much about in the context of like either like the Caribbean or like the African continent. And I just feel like it's very hard to find mainstream news about that. So just curious about like how that drives immigration and relates to the criminalization here, or drives, I should say, like people fleeing for refuge.
Right, right. Thank you for that, Akhil. That's a good question. I mean, again, no secret, the US is a big time imperialist force, right? They love their colonization. And we've seen that play out in a lot of, you know, Black diaspora nations, right? We look at Haiti and the way that the US played a, you know, huge hand in destabilizing that country's government, right? And their economic stability. And then, you know, of course, they had natural disasters that also took place, but there weren't infrastructures in place to, you know, keep the population safe, right? And a lot of that has to do with, you know, the imperialization that came in and took away that focus of caring for, right, these infrastructures, right, and instead are having to battle outside forces that are in their nation, right? And we see that in a lot of other African and Caribbean nations as well, is that you know, imperialist forces like the US, like France, like the British, right, will come in, sort of stake their so-called land, right? It's not theirs, it's ours. But they go in and sort of shake up government systems, and in so doing, make it so that, you know, a civil war breaks out, or they intentionally put, you know, pit ethnic groups or tribes against each other, right? And make it so that the country is now unstable. And like you said before, it forces migration and forces people to seek refuge, right? A lot of even the homophobia that we see in some of the nations today, right, are due to imperialist forces that came in and decided that they would be Christians and decided that they would impose Western ideas of homophobia. And that then became ingrained in that country's culture and led to mass amounts of Black migrants needing to seek refuge on the basis of, you know, homophobia and not feeling safe based on their identity, right? So I don't want to spend too much time talking on this. There's only a little bit of time left, but imperialism, colonialism, Western ideas of dominance and practices of dominating over Black people and their nations has played a huge role in the migration that exists today of Black people. Yeah, thank you for that.
Thank you. Francis?
I really appreciated, well, everything that was discussed today. And I really appreciate your point, Meraki, and about centering anti-Blackness in a lot of these movements. I mean, I think even the previous question, there are many, many, many Black Latinx people. And so even when we think about that history in Latin America, there are different drivers of why Indigenous and Black Latinx people come to the US. And then that's what I find myself constantly having that conversation. I was practicing immigration law the past few years now, went to working more in detention settings and ICE detention centers. And it's that constant conversation where it's just like, but that's them and this is me. Like, this is what happened to me, right? I'm like, okay, but I think that's a lot of the work, right? Is finding common ground. Because I think when we're trying to build a movement or trying to bring in people that is not just us, right? Us who are in this room. And I've been very privileged to have a great education and only learned about my history in college, never at the public schools in LA. is drawing those parallels within our communities. And at the end of the day, like, those are people who are gonna go out to vote. Like, if you're a non-US citizen, you're depending on people who look like you to hopefully vote on your behalf. And that's really not the case. That's what we saw in the last election, this idea of like, just like, I'm just speaking for like Latinidad, it's just like, we're all just put into one box. And it's just like, we have extremely different histories. Like, you're talking about 2 continents, various countries. And I don't know, this is maybe something that we can discuss at a later time, but just how, I'm sure this also comes up in bringing Black individuals together in a movement. Like, that is also a different history, right? People coming from different countries versus people who are African-American. We see that here within, Mexican American who've been here for like generations versus recent migrants. And this whole, like, we're different and we're not we're not related. And I'm like, but kind of. So yeah, I think I honestly am like, that's a question I'm constantly asking myself, because as much as I like to see people, my peers at rallies and demonstrations, I like really want to see my community, like in Inglewood, people I live next to come out. And it's really hard when we don't have that history and the education. And I think that's constantly overlooked because we go and we're just jumping ahead. And any kind of reform, I mean, I don't think that's like, I think it has to be like a revolution, right? Like, needs to be, we want it to be immediate. We want to stir things up right now, but I also think requires that patience and that level of like sincerity within ourselves, and also acknowledging that we can't just be talking at our elders, right? Like, they also have a certain history that hasn't been recognized, and we're just jumping ahead sometimes. And we have to also to call them in order to like join our sides. And I don't know if anyone has tips on doing that, that would be great, because I've worked all over the US on immigration issues, and it's the constant struggle.
Yeah, Francis, thank you so much for that. Sorry, Hamid, were you going to speak on?
No, I was just going to make an announcement. Please go ahead as we close out.
Okay. I'll be quick. I'll just say that it's white supremacy that makes us focus more on our differences, right, than on our similarities. At the end of the day, always blame white supremacy. That's my go-to. Blame the systems that we live in, blame the, anti-Blackness and anti, unity that it really pushes out in all of its rhetoric, because they want us to focus more on the fact that, okay, we're a Black community, you're a Latina community we're living in the same zip code, right? Or living in the same city or county. But they want us to focus on those differences instead of focusing on the fact that we're both being oppressed by the same institutions and by the same systems of oppression, right? And these systems are all upholding white supremacy. So I could speak on that forever, so I'm gonna just stop right there, but focusing more on the things that we have in common, and the ways that we need to work together to, abolish and dismantle the systems that keep us focusing on our differences instead. But yeah, thank you for that.
Thank you. That's a great note to close out. I just wanted to invite folks on our next week's Tuesday evening, fourth Tuesday of the month conversation, which is around data-driven policing. And for that, we'll continue with the collective learning and the reading of our report, Automating Banishment, the Surveillance and Policing of Looted Land. And we started section 3 of the report last Tuesday. So next Tuesday we'll be going back to and finishing up section 3, which really is about it talks about real estate and capitalist crisis, where it talked about that how, and this was through various documents that we got through public records, and exposed the deep connections and basically a conspiracy being hatched between real estate developers, land developers, the the city attorney's office and the LAPD. So we're going to continue with that, talk about the role of business improvement districts and others. And then secondly, tomorrow, please, if you have time, that keep on going after. So Martios, do you want to quickly just announce what's going on tomorrow as we close out?
Sure, yeah. So we in the War on Youth Fight have been fighting this targeted violence terrorism prevention grant that was awarded to the LAPD last year. And what this grant does is it expands the LAPD PATH program. It's a rebrand of a countering violent extremism grant. And it deputizes 500 educators, school counselors, and faith leaders to surveil youth, looking for these risk factors, which could just be something as innocuous as like youth getting mad or being too into their culture. And we've seen it target Black, Muslim, Indigenous, and immigrant youth. So tomorrow, this is going in front of the Public Safety Committee at City Council, where they'll be voting on whether or not it should go to the larger City Council. And we're trying to squash it before it gets any further. We need everybody to kind of jump in and help us fight back. One way you can do that is by signing the petition. Well, the email campaign I've gotten down there. Okay. And Akil, if you want to add anything to that.
I think you covered it. Yeah, thank you, Matios. And also, yeah, feel free to, if people are interested in joining, to our working meeting tomorrow at 6 p.m. And you can email stoplapdspying@gmail.com to get the Zoom link.
Great. And this one also includes where people can dial into the Public Safety Committee. Okay, so is it possible maybe we can post the toolkit as well, which has that information? Thank you very much. Well, this is great. Kim, Nina, do you all have any last comment or something?
I do, but I'm in the middle of a bite.
No, don't want to disturb that. All good.
Thursday, the mapping working group is meeting. Chris, at 3 p.m.
That's right.
I guess everyone can email stoplapdspying.
We'll do that for sure. Nina, anything from you?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to say thank you all for being part of this conversation, and for both Abe and Kim, Maraki, and Hamid for talking and also in centering our communities are not a monolith, our movements are not a monolith. And so I think that it's really important conversations to have.
Great, thank you. And thank you so much, Maraki, for the co-facilitation, and for everything that was raised. So, well, thank you all. Be safe, be healthy, and the recording of this should be available on our website, on the YouTube account, Stop LAPD Spying Coalition. So by Saturday evening or Sunday morning, it should have been uploaded. So all the rest of the webinars are also available on that. So hopefully we'll see you all next Tuesday, February 22nd at 6 p.m. Thank you very much and have a good night. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.